Welcome. Good morning, and thank you for joining me today. Martha Crenshaw, Professor Emerita at Stanford University. It's a real pleasure to see you again. I'd like to talk with you for maybe 30 minutes or so about a variety of topics, starting with way back at the beginning when you were a doctoral student at the University of Virginia. What led to your interests in studying revolutionary terrorism, and particularly the case of the FLN in Algeria?
Well, remember that this was quite a long time ago, and it was during the Vietnam War. So there was a lot of interest among academics in insurgency, guerrilla warfare, unconventional warfare, various titles. Terrorism per se was really not a major topic. It was actually rather a neglected topic, and that's how I happened to choose it for a seminar paper. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I read that, there's really very little written on terrorism. And then what I say about it, I couldn't do a conventional literature review because there really wasn't very much out there. So I thought, well, I'll need to do a case study. What shall I do? And I had spent my junior year abroad in Paris, which would have been 1965, 1966. And the Algerian War only ended in 1962, so it was still very recent in the minds of the French and featured in presidential debates, for example, in the presidential elections that year. So I thought, well, I'll look at the Algerian War, I'll look at the use of terrorism by the National Liberation Front and ask myself why, what for, what purpose did it serve? The prevailing impression, at least in France at that time, was that this was an example of just, in effect, a fanatical mentality. So it was just that actually from some of their points of view, all Arabs had this mentality that led them to atrocities, which seemed to me to be biased and a terrible overgeneralization. So as I developed the paper, developed it into a master's thesis and then into the PhD thesis, I became more and more convinced that this was part of a strategy. It wasn't simply an accident, an outburst of anger, rage. It was truly purposeful and deliberate on the part of the FLN. So, obviously it was difficult to get at primary sources. The war had not been over that long. And going to Algeria, for example, and saying you wanted to talk about the use of terrorism by the ruling government, the FLN was not a popular thing to do. But I did go back to France and spent a couple of years there. Was able to find archives, interview some people, both people in the French military, people who had been close to the FLN, some interviewing. Don't want to exaggerate how much I did, but that was how I came to write about Algeria. And I was very fortunate in that my graduate school advisor, Ed Collaget, who wound up at the University of Illinois, encouraged me to send off a chapter of my master's thesis to a journal for publication. I certainly never would have presumed to do such a thing, but lo and behold, the Journal of Conflict Resolution published one of the chapters of my what was then just my master's thesis. That was the Concept of Revolutionary Terrorism in 1972. So that was how I got my start, and then terrorism just kept happening more and more. And so I kept following and being asked to write about it. And then of course developed other dimensions, psychology, and now focus on organizations.
So it sounds like you had a really good mentor that encouraged you. I was wondering if any of the other faculty members gave you any resistance to you studying terrorism as a doctoral student.
Well, I mostly worked with Ed Collaget and also with another faculty member at Virginia, Robert Wood. And they were both encouraging to me. And in those days, I can't remember who else might have been on my dissertation committee, but mostly your advisor was the person who determined whether it was okay and if it was okay with your advisor. And it was okay with him. Like I say, I was very fortunate. I could have just had faculty members who discouraged me entirely from pursuing it. And I was also fortunate that when I got to Wesleyan, which was my first academic job, I asked them early on, well, if I do research on terrorism, can I get tenure, or is that a subject that is just too extraordinary and too controversial? And they said, no, it's good enough for us. And so I continued my work there.
Interesting. I was going to follow up on that a little bit about Wesleyan. So they didn't have any problems with you doing research. What about coursework? Did they allow you to develop and teach courses on terrorism at the graduate level?
Yes, I began teaching a course on terrorism. I can't remember how long. I'm not sure whether I did immediately. I think for a couple of years I was needed to teach things that were that they had a need for somebody to teach in sort of the general IR and political science field. And then after I'd been there 2 or 3 years, I began to develop more specialized courses of my own. And I did begin to teach a course on terrorism, and I taught it there for, oh, obviously for a very long time, 30 years or so. And I learned a lot from that. That's how you keep up your reading, you have your ideas challenged by students. It was a real pleasure to teach that course.
Sure. And you were in the Department of Government
Mhm.
initially, and then you expanded to include international studies and global affairs and such. The students who would take a course on terrorism, this is during the late 1970s, early 1980s, into the 1990s. What sort of degrees were they pursuing? What majors were they pursuing that they would want to take a course on terrorism? Was it all political science, or was it?
Well, one of my students who wrote her thesis under me was Paige Fortner, who's now the head of the Saltzman Institute at Columbia, and is working on a book on terrorism and Sri Lanka. So
Hmm.
I did have students who went on to study terrorism per se. Others, of course, who didn't, but who did often remember. Uh, I could name quite a few students who've become successful academics over the years.
Mhm.
So it could just be Wesleyan is, an interdisciplinary sort of place, small, liberal arts oriented, and I always restricted the size of the class to, say, about 25 or so students so that we could actually talk about it rather than my getting up and giving a lecture every day. So it was a very interactive sort of course. But I taught courses on the Middle East, on decision making and foreign policy. I didn't just teach terrorism at all. I taught a lot of different things over the years.
Before you started working at Wesleyan, you worked at the Congressional Research Service for a few years. I
Mhm.
know many of us still feel it's a very essentially important organization. Can you tell us a little bit what was like? Did you just focus on terrorism? Did you focus on a wide variety of topics for the Congressional Research Service?
Well, I didn't work on terrorism at all.
Oh, okay.
Um, there really wasn't, there was no demand for someone to work on terrorism so much then. This would be 1972 to 1974. There were a lot of other preoccupations for the US at that time, like winding down the war in Vietnam. In fact, I was told when I went out looking for a job that I shouldn't even mention terrorism because nobody wanted to hear about that anymore. It reminded them of Vietnam. Just don't talk about it. So you're going to study missiles and nuclear policy. But I worked as an analyst in the Foreign Affairs Division in CRS, and my sort of area, rather than being a geographical area, was special projects. So I did whatever I was asked to do, but it did not include terrorism. It included, for example, writing a case study of the decision making behind the Marshall Plan and editing a volume called Legislation on Foreign Relations, I believe, where we compiled all the legislation from a particular Congress that pertained to international affairs. And this was old days. It wasn't done by computer. It was done by cut and paste. It was laborious. But I enjoyed working for CRS and I learned a lot. And actually, one of my former Wesleyan students is now the head of CRS, Karen Donfried,
Hmm.
who held a very high-ranking position in the State Department. So,
That's terrific. Okay. Well,
yep,
we'll
she
encourage
started her
her.
career at CRS, and now She's the head of it.
It comes full circle. Well, we'll
Yes.
encourage our doctoral students who are graduating. We'll encourage them to consider working for CRS if they can't
Hmm.
land academic jobs.
They should consider it.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving into Wesleyan, you were there for several decades, and then in 2007, you moved to Stanford University and you launched this massive program, Mapping Militants. Could you talk about the Mapping Militants Project a little bit, how it got started, how it got going?
Certainly. I did move to Stanford in 2007, and I took up a position as a senior fellow in the uh, Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and specifically with the Center for International Security and Cooperation. So I had much less teaching responsibility then and much more time for research and projects. So that was in the very early years when the Department of Defense first started the Minerva initiative, which it's probably canceled now, but it was ongoing for many years. And it was a collaboration at that time between DoD and the National Science Foundation. So there was a nationwide competition for grants. And I applied for one because my idea was that a neglected aspect of terrorism was the relationship among insurgent, rebel, terrorist, militant groups, how they interact with each other. Do they compete with each other? Do they cooperate with each other? And how does this affect government policy in trying to deal with whatever we want to call it, whether we call it terrorism or simply political violence or revolution or going to get out of any kind of semantic arguments about it. So we did start by saying we were mapping terrorist organizations, but then we changed it to mapping militants because we didn't want to pursue arguments along those lines. Uh, so by mapping, we did not mean a geographical map of where these groups were located, although part of our project contained that information. We were interested in mapping the relationships, the interactions among different groups. For example, if you looked at the Sri Lankan scene, you would see that at the beginning of violence against the government, there were many, many, many different groups, and then over time, the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, managed to come out on top, mostly by destroying the other groups. So you had a pattern whereby you started with many groups, multiple groups. Over time, there's a consolidation of this resistance to the government, violent resistance, and it's dominated by just one actor. And then toward the end, that actor splinters. So you have multiple actors, consolidation, splintering, and how does that affect the course of a conflict? So it's patterns like that we were looking for. So we had to develop some kind of computer program to display this because I was very keen on the idea of visualizing these relationships. So you could just look at it, you could see that it started with multiple groups, narrowed to one, spread back out again. And so actually a Stanford undergraduate did the programming for me. He later became a lawyer for the DOJ, but his minor was computer science. And I had a group of research assistants, including some people who went on to many more important things. And we said, okay, we're going to map these groups and also linked to the icon that displays the group and how it interacted with other groups. We're going to have a profile of the group. So if you want to know more about it, we'll have a profile. And when you clicked on that group, you went to a profile. And every profile followed the same format because I wanted the profiles to be comparable to each other. At that time, we did not have very many profiles of resistance organizations, militant organizations. Some of our listeners or watchers may remember TOPS, the terrorist organization profiles that were produced by a group in Oklahoma City. Actually, the RAND Corporation produced them. And that was about all there was. And these were and are very inconsistent. Each profile, there's no common format for them. So our profiles follow a common format. So basically, this is our unit of analysis, in effect, is the conflict and the groups in the conflict. It's not the group, it's the interactive conflict system. So we began just adding systems and adding systems, which are the maps. And then the maps began to get very complicated because so many groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda, so many groups affiliated with ISIS, it became really difficult to contain them on one screen and visualize it. So I did win the Minerva competition, and that funded the project for about 5 years. Then that funding ran out, and it's very difficult, or was difficult in old days, to get renewal of a grant like that because you didn't want to do anything new. You just wanted to keep doing what you were doing. And typically government funders wanted to see a new idea out there to fund. But Stanford was very helpful, particularly the Freeman Spogli Institute under the leadership of Mike McFall, former ambassador to Russia. Mike was very sympathetic to the project and helped a lot with it. And CISAC, the center I was affiliated with, was also very helpful in providing assistance and research support. So we muddled through. And then 5 years ago, roughly, as I'm sure all of our listeners know, the Department of Homeland Security in old days created academic centers of excellence, which were research consortia. START at Maryland, with which I was affiliated, was one of the major ones. And this new one was at the University of Nebraska at Omaha called InSight under Gina Ligon. And so Gina very kindly took my project into the consortium, and we were funded by InSight and DHS until March of this year, when all funding for the Centers of Excellence was terminated. So there are no longer any centers, and so that cut off our funding in mid-year. So, however, my junior collaborator on the project, who was my research assistant at Stanford while she was getting her PhD there, is now an assistant professor at Rice University in Houston. And Rice has very kindly and helpfully offered us some support so that we can keep the project going at least, at a minimal level. So that will really be very helpful, and we're grateful for that support. So we will continue. I'm not sure how ambitious we can be as we go forward, but we're going to try to keep it going. We've been doing some extensive revisions of the website to try to make the visualizations sharper and easier to read. So it's still ongoing.
Oh, it's a very important and helpful, useful website for many scholars, students, faculty members, and so forth. So I really hope there is a long-term future for this project. It's a great resource. I got a question for you about this pattern you mentioned about the consolidation, and then there's sort of a main entity, and then there's a splinter. And I'm just kind of thinking off the cuff here. In the Palestinian territories, we've kind of seen some consolidation, I guess you can call it, in terms of Hamas being the top dog. Do you foresee that at some point in the future, if this pattern holds, the pattern that you saw elsewhere, will we see a likely split in Hamas?
It's quite possible. It really is very hard to predict. We have tried to look at, when there are splinters. And for example, what is the relationship between splinters and peace negotiations and attempts to resolve a conflict? Are you more likely to see splinters when it looks like the conflict is going to be resolved, and perhaps the more extreme elements of, say, Hamas? Let's assume there are more extreme and less extreme elements within Hamas. If the less extreme elements within Hamas are prepared to accept some sort of deal, something, will the more extreme elements then break off? Might they form alliances with some of the groups that are operating now on the West Bank? Some associated with Fatah loosely, some associated with the old PFLP groups, some representing a younger generation of fighters who wish to advance within organizations but have their paths forward blocked by an older leadership. I think it's quite possible. My Stanford colleague, Steve Stedman, wrote a classic article about spoilers in peace processes some years ago. And they, of course, often are splinters. At the same time, you can have splintering if part of a group wishes to reach a settlement and the majority of the group doesn't want to, and the splinter can break off in order to join peace negotiations. We've seen that in Colombia over the years, for example, and both of those are cases that we track. We've been tracking Colombia recently. You find so peace processes can be a cause of splintering. Uh, Also, I think in the case of Sri Lanka, not so much the peace process, but government pressure. When you had one of the leaders of the LTTE breaking off, Colonel Kahuna, broke off on his own. And once you begin to see that sort of splintering, the question is, does it make the conflict more violent? The levels of violence then go up because you now are having groups that are trying to outdo each other, or is it a path towards settlement in that the more violent extremist factions can now be pushed to the side? They're weaker typically than the parent. So we could certainly see something like that. It's been surprising a little bit to me in the Palestinian arena that the old PFLP, that there would still be remnants of the PFLP still relevant in today's political climate. They were the old kind of left version of a secular nationalist movement, and to find them still present on the scene and in effect collaborating with Hamas. Well, and there we have strange allies. Why Shiite Iran, opposed in general to Sunni Islamism, should support Hamas, except that anti-Israel, they're willing to support any group that will use violence against Israel. But it's a very interesting conflict dynamic.
Yeah, yeah, it's very, very complex context there. Your description of the more or increasing violence after or right around the time of a peace process reminded me of the Good Friday Agreement and the Provisional IRA, spawning the real IRA and the Continuity IRA. I think it still holds that Omagh, the bombing in Omagh was the worst single terrorist attack in the entire history there, and it took place after the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah. Oh, I think yes, a peace settlement is no guarantee that extremist factions won't use what's a fairly easy method for them, bombing a civilian crowd, uh, in effect, completely defenseless. And there's been a peace process. Everybody is pleased that the conflict appears to be over. You can imagine that security precautions might be uh, um, a little weaker then because you're thinking, but you always have to be prepared that there are going to be these splinters. Uh, Again, they might not be capable of a really sustained conflict or really reviving the conflict, but they can certainly lead to great destruction and harm.
Hmm. Yeah, it kind of leads to the question of how resilient is society to be able to withstand that bump in the road towards the implementation of a peace process. They really have to remain steadfast and committed to that peace process, even in the wake of attempts to spoil it.
Yes, precisely. And that's the task of the defending government to convince the population uh, that first of all, they're doing their best to protect them and to really do their best to protect them, to make sure that security measures are not relaxed
Yeah.
in the aftermath of a peace settlement, thinking it's all over, we resolved it. And also convincing the public that there may be uh, there are real dangers that are still present. And over time, of course, those factions in Northern Ireland have faded away, have become diminished,
Mhm.
become less and less and less relevant, in part through simply, I think, generational change. Uh,
Mm.
I would recruitment being a very important aspect of the maintenance of an organization. And if these little factions can no longer recruit younger people, then as the older leadership uh, dies, gives up the struggle, then they can't really renew themselves. And government wants to be certain to create conditions under which that will happen, that they can't continue to recruit.
Right, right. Help them implode and die on the vine. That should be part of the government's counterterrorism
Yes,
strategy.
yes.
Absolutely. Speaking of case studies, yeah, I'm a big fan of case studies, and I want to congratulate you on the 30th anniversary of your book, Terrorism in Context. When I read that, it was one of the first books I read in the field of terrorism studies, and it was just all those fascinating case studies. Just kind of really inspired me by the diversity of topics that one could explore in this field. Could you tell us a little bit about how your research has evolved since that time?
Well, my idea for terrorism in context began when I thought that I would write a sort of general book of case studies, and then I realized that I couldn't possibly have the necessary expertise on such a variety of cases that would represent the wide field of the use of terrorism. So I went to people who were real experts, not necessarily in terrorism, but in the conflicts that we wanted to cover. So that sort of was the culmination of my interest in doing something like that. And I was much happier with their interpretations because I thought I had a great collection of authors. And that book is still in print.
Hmm.
Lo, these many years later, it's still in print. I'm just astonished that the case studies stood the test of time. And I will say just a bit of advice to anyone wishing to edit such a book. What was really helpful was to have a preliminary workshop of all the authors in which we just sat down and discussed what we were going to do, not paper presentations, just talk it through intensely. And then we also held a conference, a mini conference, where they did present their papers, and we had discussants, and we had an audience of other academics. Uh, and then those papers were, at every stage revised and revised and revised so that hopefully in the end they fit together rather than going off in all different directions, which is sometimes the case with edited books. I have participated in these processes myself. So I think that was one of the things that made that important. So uh, after that project, or along with that project, I became interested in the psychology of terrorism. And the reason I became interested was another edited book by Margaret Herman that was on just political psychology, which was just beginning as a kind of field in the International Society of Political Psychology. ISPP was just getting its start. So this was sort of an ISPP project. And she asked me to write a chapter on the psychology of terrorism. And I was very fortunate. I had a fellowship that year from the Russell Sage Foundation. So I had time, and I'm not a psychologist. In all honesty, I never took a course on psychology. In any of my academic career, I'm completely self-taught. So it was a challenge. It was an adventure, and I had to go try to find what there might have been written at that time, uh, a long time ago, about the psychology of terrorism. Now there's some great experts in the field, but at the time there really weren't. So I had to educate myself. So I worked on the psychology of terrorism and published several things along those lines, trying to understand the thinking, the emotions that went behind participating in a group. And then I became interested in the organization because in thinking about it, well, actually, I needed to give a paper for it was the International Political Science Association meetings, and I had volunteered to give a paper, and I was scheduled to give a paper. I didn't have a paper. I think we've all found ourselves in those situations, a bit of a dilemma, and I needed to write one and fairly quickly. And I thought organizations, terrorist organizations, are like other organizations. I was reading James Q. Wilson. This is an old classic. I thought they have the same sorts of problems in keeping their members. I read Alfred Hirschman, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. You can either bind the members to the group or they'll split off, which is sometimes better for the group. And so I simply wrote about how these groups are special because they do use violence and they're usually conspiratorial undergrounds, usually. But here are the things they have in common with any political organization out there, providing incentives for the membership, maintaining loyalty, etc. So I pursued that line of thinking for a while longer. So I've just sort of gone from whatever, frankly, what interested me as a puzzle about terrorism. And of course, sadly, there were always more examples. out there to look at. Then we have Al-Qaeda coming along, we have ISIS coming along, and trying to understand what's going on there. It just seemed there was always something new to study when it comes to terrorism.
Yeah, sounds like it. I mean, it sounds like
Yes,
you kind of started with
always,
the
always.
the puzzle of the individual behavior and then expanded to the puzzles of organizational behavior. And
Mhm.
these are different avenues that graduate students even today are grappling with in these different directions. What are some of the most significant developments that you've seen in the entire field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies just overall?
Well, one quite recently that I think about and have written about a little bit. Um, Early on, when I was writing about defining terrorism, I relied a lot on the work of a political scientist, Giovanni Sartori, and how you develop a concept in political science. And he talked about developing concepts that travel. In other words, it shouldn't be a concept that's bound to a particular moment in history or place in time. It should have generalizability, as we say. And can terrorism be such a concept? And I have argued that it could, and I've tried to support that. But I see more and more that context comes to dominate one's interpretation of terrorism. So take the controversy in the US in particular about whether or not certain attacks by groups on the extreme right, Proud Boys, for example, could be considered terrorism or not. And obviously, people who oppose those groups and their behavior wish to call them terrorists. Those who don't support or are more tolerant of their behavior do not wish to, and it becomes a huge political controversy. So, what is terrorism? What is not? And I feel like we've struggled with defining terrorism for so many years, but we're back in that dilemma. So, January the 6th, was that assault on the Capitol terrorism or not? Uh, can we develop a concept of terrorism that's independent of the context within which it occurs? It's just still an enormous struggle. I still think of terrorism as a type of violence that's perpetrated by a conspiracy. It is organized, it is deliberate. It's not crowd violence, it's not street fighting, it's not brawling. Those are all bad things, destructive things, violence, but not all violence that is politically motivated by is terrorism, whether it's by any non-state actor. So how do you make that distinction and maintain that distinction in a way that might convince people? You still see the term terrorism used just as a term of opprobrium, what your adversary does. Look at the huge conflict over Gaza and terrorism and genocide, and you just immediately are typed as one side or the other. If you say this was terrorism, this was not terrorism, you're it's to use the term terrorism is to take a political position. Can we ever get beyond that? So I struggle with that to this day. And of course, I'm also still interested in the relationships among groups, my Mapping Militants Project, and uh, my colleague, Caitlin Robinson at Rice, and I are working on a paper on when groups attack outside the borders of what would be considered their home conflict, the conflict that they're primarily engaged in. So, for example, take Somalia. Al-Shabaab wishes to overthrow the government of Somalia and create a state that would be ruled by Islamic law. Why are they attacking outside? Other groups don't. The Islamic State in Somalia doesn't. There are numerous other similar examples. So what is it? What leads a group to wish to expand the conflict, to lead to spillover of conflict? In the case of Somalia, the conventional argument is that there are foreign interveners, and so they're punishing foreign interveners like Ethiopia and Kenya. Uganda. But it's not quite so simple as that, because you've got a lot of foreign forces in Somalia. Why wouldn't you just attack them there? Why do you go to their home country? Is it a matter of resources? Is it a matter of inflicting pain on civilians deliberately? In the case of Al-Shabaab, is it a case of gaining credibility? within the wider jihadist movement, trying to explore what's going on. So we've surveyed a lot of conflicts and discovered that about a third of them do expand in that way, that militant organization expands outside the borders of the country in question. So we're trying to figure out what are the characteristics of those groups. And in particular, if you look at groups that already have a globalist ideology, they're affiliated with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but they don't all attack outside the boundaries of their home conflict. Who does and who doesn't? So that's one of the things we're working on now.
There's a whole complex of different influences that kind of lead into those decisions made by organizations. Again, organizational behavior and what influences.
Yes, yes, it's a decision on the part of the organization. It's most studies of this kind of conflict spillover focus on state level attributes, demographics, and such as that. And we're looking at the organization. What is it that would lead them to decide to use their resources outside the country?
Mhm.
Is it just a question of resources? Is it ideology? What's going on? So we're still trying to figure that out. It's turned out to be very complicated, of course.
Yeah, it sounds like there's all kinds of complicated things in this field of study. Lone actors.
Yes,
How do
yes.
we account for the lone actors, the decisions that they make to engage in this sort of activity as well that we call terrorism?
Mhm. Well, I'll join a host of other scholars and pundits in the effect of AI, artificial intelligence, on the behavior of these groups. For a number of years, we've been concerned about ways in which they can exploit emerging technologies. Audrey Cronin has a good book recently on how they've used uh, destructive technologies, often something in the public domain adapted to their own purposes. Uh, so in addition to the effect of social media on terrorism, which is an important subject that's being studied by a number of people now, I think that's really important to pursue. How has that changed the ways in which groups organize, the ways in which they uh, gather resources, fundraising, choice of targets, surveillance, and now how will artificial intelligence affect their abilities, affect their decisions, affect the opportunities that are open to them. And similarly, the other side of the coin, how could AI help counterterrorism efforts? And I truly do not know it all because I don't know enough about artificial intelligence, but I know that most graduate students coming along now are much more technically trained than I am and than I was. We were all educated in an earlier day when that was not really at the forefront. But I think those are very, very important issues because when are groups innovative? This is something that I wrote about years ago and still don't know the answer to. When are they encouraged to take these technological developments and adapt them to their purposes and also come up with some really new ideas? So at the same time, not forgetting that a lot of these new ideas that turn out to be terribly destructive have very little to do with a great technological inventiveness, such as 911, that the idea that they could hijack these planes, or I guess, yes, they were hijacked and not commandeered, but that they would have been able to fly the plane into a building. Nobody thought, it just didn't. I think nobody who worked in the field ever thought there might have been some novels that had every kind of, we regarded that as implausible. So it's those sorts of surprises. Uh, what are some other examples of when we've been enormously surprised? Why were we surprised? Why didn't we see what was coming? I think that could make a really interesting project. It could be case studies of surprise attack, in effect. So, but in the terrorist field.
At the root of all this is the mysteries of human behavior.
Mm.
That human beings we're kind of naturally wired to try and figure our way around obstacles. I always joke with my students that one day if they have children, if you hide the cookie jar, your children are going to find the cookie jar, right? It's something that humans do. We figure out our way around different kind of challenges and obstacles, and so that applies to terrorist groups as well. They're going to innovate. They're going to figure out their way around the obstacles that we're going to put in front of them. And that's one of the reasons why this field of study is so complicated, but also open to all kinds of different areas. pursuit. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell readers of Terrorism and Political Violence, or the graduate students, other scholars, researchers that we haven't already touched on?
No, except that don't give up on studying terrorism because it's controversial. You can take an objective approach to it. It's important that we continue to do research, and don't be discouraged by the political climate, emphasis on one ideology over another ideology. I think it's going to be difficult going forward because it's going to be difficult to get funding for research projects that require funding. For example, creating enormous statistical data collections, which have been very important to the progress of research. That's an expensive endeavor, and without support from government or major foundations, it's going to be hard to sustain that. But we have a lot of data that we've collected over the years that could be probably exploited more thoroughly. There's basic work that needs to be done in integrating databases so that we can link different factors, different variables to each other more efficiently. There's a lot to be done out there. And also never to forget that simply the conceptual thinking behind research, there's a lot of room still for that, for new ideas in terms of how we approach terrorism, how we distinguish terrorism from other forms of violence, or how we understand, for example, organizations or psychology, and similarly the links between terrorism and state rivalries. It seems to me that's something that's not been explored a lot in recent years. We sort of, I think, in a way, we blamed the Soviet Union, we blame Iran, but there are more complicated ways in which great power relations and non-state actor violence are linked to each other. So that would be an avenue of inquiry as well.
This is great stuff. Great. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
I can always think of ideas for other
This is
people.
terrific. Excellent. Excellent. Yes, we definitely appreciate it. Thank you again for your time and for inspiring readers of terrorism, political violence, and students for many generations to come. Hopefully, this video will be useful to them.
I hope so. It's my
Congratulations again.
pleasure.
Congratulations on all your success. Best wishes for continued success. I hope you have a wonderful summer, and thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, James. I was really happy to do it, and good luck with TPV. I know it's going to make waves, hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. Bye.